All right. Today, we are digging into a really thought-provoking text by an author named J.F. Pointon. It's called The Irreconcilable Core. Now, the big claim here is that there's a single, fundamental idea that explains how our entire global economy works, and, according to the author, why it's constantly lurching into crisis. So let's get into it. So Pointon starts with something we all have in our pockets, a smartphone. And the point made is that to create this one little device, it takes a truly mind-bending planetary-scale social effort. You've got miners in the Congo, chip designers in California, factory workers in China, software engineers, logistics experts, millions of people all coordinated across the globe. It's really a modern miracle of what the author calls socialized production. And right there, that's the central puzzle of the whole text. If it takes this massive, collective social effort to make things, how is it that the immense wealth that comes from it ends up in the hands of a tiny fraction of people? The author's answer is that this isn't some accident or a bug we can just fix. No, they argue it's the core feature of the system itself. So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at what the author calls the core contradiction. Then, we'll unpack the two sides of that coin, production versus accumulation. We'll see how that tension supposedly acts as an engine of crisis. Then, we'll look at why the text argues that all the solutions tend to fail. And finally, we'll get to the text's ultimate argument. Okay, first things first, the core contradiction. According to Pointon, everything else in the book, all the analysis, it all flows from this one single concept. If you get this, you've pretty much got the key to the entire argument. And here it is. The author defines it as the irreconcilable contradiction. It's this deep conflict between, on the one hand, how we make things, which is socialized and collective, and on the other hand, how wealth is owned, which is private. And that word, irreconcilable, is so important here. The author isn't saying it's a tricky problem. They're saying it's a conflict that literally cannot be solved or balanced within the current system. It's baked into its DNA. All right, let's dig into those two sides a little bit more. We really need to understand what the author means by these two forces that are constantly pulling in opposite directions. Production on one side, accumulation on the other. Okay, so on the one side, you have socialized production. That's the world of the smartphone we just talked about. It runs on collective effort, global coordination, all of our shared knowledge, what the text actually calls the general intellect, and of course, societal infrastructure like roads and the internet. But then, on the other side, you've got private accumulation. This side doesn't run on cooperation, it runs on private ownership, a relentless profit motive, and competitive pressure. Its main function, the author argues, is the extraction of surplus value. Basically, capturing the wealth created by that collective labor as private profit. To really hammer this home, Pointon pulls out this famous quote from Karl Marx. The point is to show that this drive to accumulate isn't just a casual preference for making money. It's framed as an absolute command. The logic of the system, according to the author, is that a company must accumulate, or else it will be destroyed by its competitors. And it's this relentless logic that the text argues shapes our entire global society. Now, this constant tug of war between social production and private accumulation, it isn't stable. The author argues it acts like a powerful, dynamic engine, an engine that creates crisis after crisis and actually drives historical change, forcing the system to evolve and transform itself to survive. And you can see how the author tracks this through history. The argument is that the scale of the contradiction has just gotten bigger and bigger. You know, back in the 19th century, it was mainly playing out in factories inside of individual countries. By the mid-20th century, it went global, with huge monopolies battling over resources and markets. And now, in our time, the text claims it's reached its peak intensity, with these incredibly complex global supply chains and a financial system that connects everything. So what do these crises actually look like? Well, according to the text, they follow a pretty clear pattern. First, you get crises of overproduction. The system is so efficient, but because the drive is to keep wages low, people can't actually afford to buy back all the stuff they produce. This, in turn, leads to falling rates of profit. And as technology replaces people, who the author says are the only source of new value, that profit squeeze gets worse. So when making actual things isn't profitable enough, where does all that money go? Into finance. It creates speculative bubbles. And then finally, woven through all of this is ecological breakdown, because an endless drive for growth has to treat the planet as an infinite resource to be exploited, not a finite home. Now, the obvious question is, if these crises are so predictable, why can't we just fix them? Well, this is a huge part of Pointon's argument. The reason, the text says, is that every solution we've tried only ever addresses the symptoms, never the core contradiction itself. the text lays out this whole cycle of failed fixes. Think technology will save us? The author argues it just automates jobs away and makes the profit problem worse in the long run. Okay, what about globalization? Well, that just deepens inequality and makes us dependent on these incredibly fragile global supply chains. What if the government steps in? The text says that might put a temporary patch on things, but as long as private accumulation is the goal, the fundamental problem remains. Each of these solutions, from financial wizardry to war, is presented as just another way to kick the can down the road, making the underlying problem even bigger and more dangerous for the next time around. And all of this, the contradiction, the engine of crisis, the failed fixes, it all builds to the book's final, and I have to say, very radical argument about where we stand today. So here's the final turn in the argument. The author claims that the very system that unleashed all this incredible productive power, the system that gave us the ability to build smartphones and sequence genomes, has now become a fetter. It's like a chain, holding back our own potential. The argument is that we've built a system capable of producing enough for everyone, but its own internal rules, its own DNA, make it impossible to actually realize that potential. So, if the contradiction is truly irreconcilable, and if the system has become a fetter on itself, then what's the logical conclusion, according to the author? Well, it's that the system can't be reformed. The text asserts that the only way forward is to finally resolve the contradiction, to make the way we own wealth as social as the way we create it. And that, the author argues, requires a move to socialized, democratic control over the economy.
And, the author really doesn't pull any punches. This quote here says it all. The text makes it very clear that, in its view, tinkering around the edges is no longer an option. The argument is that the moment calls for a fundamental transformation, not just a series of repairs. So, we're left with this massive question that sits at the very heart of Pointon's work. Is this tension, this deep conflict between our collective power to produce and the private drive for profit, is it just a flaw? Something we can manage with better policies and smarter regulations? Or, as this text argues, is it a hard structural limit, something that can't be fixed but must be overcome? That's the challenge posed by the Irreconcilable Core.